Did you enjoy the weather today?
Yes.
I want you to know I brought it from Southern California.
Thank you.
Can you stick around?
Unseasonal warm weather in Southern California, and it followed. Now that's the good news. The bad news is I think it's going to desert me before I go back. I can't promise it all week, but wasn't this a lovely, lovely day? I did not see one single traffic jam all day. I didn't know these kind of places existed. All right, I assume you know we're studying trials this week. That's the subject of the book of James. And I have a choice. We can either run through the book, or we can slowly go through some of the book. And I've chosen to slowly go through some of the book, so you are forced to invite me back. That's cool. Seriously, we're not going to get very deep in the book, but we're going to go very deep in how to handle trials. So tonight we're going to continue that. Tomorrow night we're going to continue that. Tuesday night, James abruptly discusses temptation. And it is the most detailed explanation of temptation in the New Testament. The temptation of Christ. There's a passage in 1 John and the Garden of Eden, and that's about it. But this passage explains temptation like no other. And I think it will help you analyze when is something a temptation and when is it a sin? Or to say that same thing in a way, at what point does the temptation become a sin? Very, very fascinating study. Of all the passages in James, that one for some reason just captured my attention over the years. We're going to look at it Tuesday night. All right? Got it? Good. At the beginning of a school term, the teacher usually tells the students what is expected of them during that semester or quarter. It might go something like this. If you do the daily assignments, if you read and report on 2 books, and you do fairly well on the final, you could get an A for the course. On the other hand, if you don't, then all kinds of bad things could happen. But what teachers know is that students don't just do it because you give them an assignment. As a matter of fact, most teachers have discovered that there are more B's and C's than A's. So they have to underscore that part about what happens if you don't. And so it might go something like this. Let's suppose that you don't do well on the final. However, you do those daily assignments and you read and report on those 2 books, then you'll get a B in the course. And if, let's say you didn't do those 2 book reports and you didn't do real well on those daily assignments, then you could expect a C on the course. And then the teacher might say something like this: if you don't do those daily assignments, that's really, really important. If you don't do those daily assignments, don't even show up for the final because you have already failed the course. Now, a good teacher tells you what the assignments are, tells you what will happen if you do, and tells you what happens if you don't. In the book of James, the church is a classroom. The Christians are students, and James is a teacher. And he's talking about tests, he's talking about life. And he opens the book by telling us how to handle life and what to do, what we will get if we do handle it properly. If you were here in our first session this morning, then you do remember what that is, right? Trials are for our training. So therefore, if we rest in the Lord, I'm taking in chronological order, and rejoice and we remain steadfast and request wisdom, then what do we get? Spiritual maturity. We get things like endurance. We get spiritual qualities added to our lives. We end up spiritually mature, including wisdom. But James is a good teacher. So what happens if we don't? Suppose you have a test and you flunk. Well, no big deal, right? I mean, what's one test? But what happens if you don't do those daily assignments, which begins, in the case of James, with trusting the Lord? Well, that's what James tells us next. And that's what I want us to look at. So will you turn with me to James chapter 1. And while you're doing that, let me tell you a story. A fellow was walking through the woods, came upon a log. On the end of the log was a little cocoon. And the butterfly was about to emerge, but it was struggling. So the fellow stopped, caught his attention. He watched. And then he felt sorry for the butterfly. So he took out his little pocket knife and he slit the cocoon so that the butterfly could get out quicker. Sure enough, the butterfly popped out from the cocoon and landed on the log, flapped its wings, and didn't go anywhere. Tried again. The fellow was so enthralled with this process, he just decided to watch it to see what would happen. Camping. What he discovered is that little butterfly could never fly off of that log. Died. When he got back home, he talked to somebody who knew about such things and said, well, I don't understand how a newborn butterfly couldn't fly. What happened? And when he told him the story, that little expert said, you short-circuited the process. You see, that little process is designed to strengthen those wings. And you let him out too early and he didn't develop all the muscles in the wings, so he could not fly. Now, that's serious stuff. I mean, the little butterfly was designed to fly. And if you short-circuit the process, you don't learn to fly. Now, that's what James is warning us about. Don't short-circuit this process. Because if you do, you're never going to learn to soar spiritually. You're never going to learn to fly. All right? How serious is it? What will happen to me? I don't trust the Lord through the trials of life. Well, in James chapter 1, he says in verse 6, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven by the wind. Let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. As I understand these verses, James is telling us that 3 things will happen to you if you don't respond properly. But first, he reminds us again what it means to respond properly. And this is very, very important. Look at the first phrase in verse 6. Let him ask in faith. Now you might conclude that that's related to verse 5. Because in verse 5 he says, if any lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. So he's introduced the subject of prayer in verse 5, and so he says in verse 6, but when you ask in faith. So surely verse 6 is related to verse 5. And there's an element of truth to that. Obviously, you should ask for wisdom in faith. But in the Greek text, ask in faith in verse 6 is really talking about the state of faith. That you should ask out of a state of faith, as if to say, this is your lifestyle, this is your habit. And in that sense, it probably goes all the way back to verse 3. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. So what he's saying is, make sure you are trusting the Lord. And in that circumstance, and under that condition, then you can ask in faith. So your lifestyle, the habits of your life, is you're learning to trust the Lord with the little, medium, and severe sizes of trials. And if you do, as I pointed out, you get endurance. If nothing else, you'll develop some endurance. And you'll get some wisdom. You'll learn to get some skill how to handle life. But ultimately, you'll be mature. You'll lack nothing in the sense of being spiritually mature. So, verse 6 is telling you what to do. But he says in verse 6, with no doubt. Don't doubt. Now that can be confusing. What does it mean to not doubt? Well, this verse is not exactly talking about doubting in the sense of I doubt the Lord is true, or the Bible is true, or something like that. This is in the context of a trial. So he's saying, don't doubt, and the word means something like, don't debate. Don't start struggling within yourselves. Actually, this word means to decide, to judge, to be divided in one's mind, to debate. It's translated contend in Acts 11:2 and Jude verse 9. So it's not talking about doubting the truthfulness of Christianity or the truthfulness of the Bible. You may have a few doubts, and that's not the point. The point is that in this trial, you're hesitating, trusting the Lord to get you through this trial. You're at odds with yourself. So let me read to you what some Bible teachers have said about this. One said, it's a man whose allegiance wavers, not one tormented by speculative intellectual questionings, which do not fall within James' horizon. In other words, he's saying, look, we're not talking about doubting the Bible or doubting that Jesus is the Son of God, doubting the truthfulness of Christianity. We're struggling in this temptation. Is God going to see me through this? Is God going to really work in my life? Another says, it is a basic conflict in loyalties between God and money, or God and the world. And another says, such a person is gripped with uncertainty and perplexity. So, the people in the midst of the trial ask for wisdom, that's verse 5, and yet they struggle. And when the struggle comes, they're constantly choosing to believe God no matter what on one hand, and on the other, they start debating or hesitating or vacillating. You ever been there? You ever have that civil war going on within you, and something's going on and you say, I know I should trust the Lord. And then the doubts and the struggle, the debate takes over. I think I've talked to people who saw me on Sunday. They were going through it, and I reminded them, God is faithful, trust Him. He'll give you peace. He's working, all things work together for good. And they leave my presence and they say, I'm going to trust the Lord. That's Sunday. Monday, they're right back at it. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure I can get through this. You know, they lose all their peace and all their trust, and call me on Tuesday, and we have another biblical conversation. We get to the end of that. I'm going to trust the Lord no matter what. Works for about 20 minutes, 20 hours, and then Wednesday we're back at, I don't know. They're hesitating, they're vacillating. And that's the kind of thing that he is describing. The most extreme case of it I've ever seen. I think this conversation happened once when I was preaching in Minnesota. I don't remember for sure. I remember the lady I talked to talking about her son. He was trying to determine the will of God. And he decided it was the will of God for him to go to a Bible college that was in the north. So he enrolled, got accepted, and went to Bible college in the north. At the end of the first semester, he decided he made a mistake, and he transferred to a Bible college in the south. Over the summer, he decided he made a mistake, and he transferred back to the Bible college in the north. In the middle of the term, he decided he had made a mistake, and he transferred back to the Bible college in the south. True story. Second summer, third year, he transfers back to the Bible college in the north. In the middle of the year, he transferred back to the Bible college in the south. Now, that is an extreme case, but a good illustration of what happens. And it happens all the time in all of us. Trial gets bad enough. How many people? This is a common occurrence for a pastor. Should I quit this job? I mean, I'm so unhappy there. Well, that might not be a bad idea. Just make sure you got another one to go to first or something. Or, I'm so unhappy in this marriage. One day I decided I'm going to stick with it. The next day I decided, well, I don't know. Is it the will of God? I mean, does the Bible allow for that? You know, on, those kind of debates. So that's the kind of thing he's describing. The person is basically, let me choose a word, unsettled. There's not the calm peace that comes from resting in the Lord. There's this unsettledness in your soul, this hesitation, this struggle, this debate that's going on. Well, you know, be careful. If you're not trusting the Lord, that's a possible result. Now, he continues to describe this. He says in verse 6, he who doubts, and this is, the word doubt is an unfortunate translation, he who debates is like a wave of the sea, driven. What a vivid word. Have you ever felt driven? Well, let me tell you, I've talked to plenty of people that felt driven by the wind. Instead of it being a calm, tranquil lake, the winds come up and they're driven. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida. We had hurricanes where I grew up. And I can remember as a teenager, the hurricanes, my mother liked to dive when I wouldn't do this. And I wanted to go down and watch the Gulf of Mexico. The waves, the wind was stirring up the waves and they would come in and pound the shore. It was just exciting to me as a teenager to watch the waves driven by the wind. Driven. I don't know how many times people have come to me with a problem and I've said, how many counselors have you talked to? 10? 5? Some people are just driven. They just go from one counselor to another, or one pastor to another. It's like a butterfly fluttering from one flower to the other to gather nectar, and they just are driven. But look at what he says in verse 6. They are driven and tossed. So he says they are like a wave of the sea that's driven and tossed. So the wave is driven up against the shore and it's tossed up in the air. May, with all due respect to James, I changed the imagery just a bit. Let's talk about a cork. A cork that's in the midst of this storm in the sea and the wave is slapping it around and it pops up. It's tossed and it's driven and it plops down and it's driven some more and it pops up and people are inside are like that cork that's driven and being tossed up and down. Isn't that an interesting illustration? So people worry, they have a trial, they don't know how to handle it, and what do they say? I went to bed and I was tossing and turning. If you aren't resting in the Lord, you're not going to rest when you go to bed, right? Now, fess up. Did you ever get so worried about something so that it affected your sleep? Some of you are shaking your head. You're unsettled in your soul. And James says, now be careful. You need to trust the Lord. And as you trust the Lord, there will be peace. Now, there's lots more in James, but I want you to turn to Philippians. Philippians. My object is to teach the book of James, at least part of it. But there are a couple of other passages that I think are super important that you learn. I quoted one of them this morning. You need to write it down, you need to remember it, and you need to memorize it. It is Hebrews 4:16. Coming boldly to the throne of grace that you might obtain mercy and grace to help in time of need. And the other passage is super critical for your spiritual life, is Philippians 4:6 and 7. 4:6 and 7. I'll show you how this relates to James in a minute. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. That's where all of us should be all of the time. We should be resting in the Lord. It doesn't use the word trust here, but obviously it's the opposite of worry, is faith, trust. So he says, do not worry about anything. Anything. But with prayer, with thanksgiving, in prayer, let your requests be made known. And what do you get out of that? You get the peace of God. Now there's a difference between peace with God, which comes when you trust Jesus Christ for eternal life, and peace with God and the peace of God. The peace of God is when you're just saying, I'm going to trust the Lord. Hebrews 4:16. I'm going to, with thanksgiving, not worry. I'm going to let my requests be made known. Lord, this is what I would prefer. This is what I would like you to do. And what do you get out of that? An answer? Not necessarily. There are passages that say if you pray according to the will of God, you've got that. If you pray in faith, meaning you trust the will of God, you've got the will of God on it, you got it. This passage doesn't guarantee you an answer. It just says, don't worry, pray with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known. And what you have is peace, calmness of soul. Now that's a decision that you make. You decide, I'm going to trust the Lord. What's the opposite of that? That's where James 1:6 comes in. So you don't trust the Lord. Then what? You debate, you struggle, you toss, and you turn. So those are your options. Choose you this day which one you prefer. It's a choice. This passage in Philippians was driven home to me recently by my brother, who is a seminary graduate. He also has a doctorate in psychology. He's had a private practice, and he's pastor of church. He's done all kinds of things. But if you go to him, he's going to end up in that passage. He came to my church and spoke, and we had dinner with a couple in the church, and he got into a conversation with that couple. There were 6 of us. And, he really drove that home, and I walked out thinking, gotta make more out of that passage. But it's true. It's absolutely true. You're either trusting the Lord, or you're wringing your hands. You're worried. So since then, he's had a problem or two. As a matter of fact, he has some heart problems. And he said to me on the phone recently, I started to get anxious. And he said, I remembered Philippians 4:6, and I said, I'm not going there. I'm not going to worry about that. Lord, here it is. This is my request. I'm going to trust you to work this out, health-wise, but it's yours. And I'm just not going to worry about it. Would that be a great way to live? Well, let me tell you. It all comes down to walking by faith, trusting the Lord. Let him ask him from a state of faith. All right, back to James 1. That's the first thing that will happen if you don't live by faith. You're not going to rest in the Lord. You're not going to rest in bed. Look at verse 7. Let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. Oh, it's getting to be more serious. In the Greek text, that is in fact. The word for at the beginning of the verse means he's talking about verse 6. The man that's not asking in faith, that man, he's not going to receive anything from the Lord. He's not talking about being a hypocrite. A hypocrite is somebody who says one thing and does another. That's not what we're talking about here. As a matter of fact, in this case, you can't hide it. You are well aware of what you're doing and probably talk about it. And probably can't hide it. You're a divided person. You're struggling. You're caught between two. In Pilgrim's Progress, he has a character named Mr. Facing Both Ways. That's who we're talking about. Augustine said, Lord, grant me purity, but not yet. It's that attitude. I want the will of God, but not just yet. Now, James says, if you go that far, you're not trusting the Lord, then God is not going to answer your prayer. As a pastor, I've been asked this many times. You know, I'm going through a problem and I'm struggling with it, and I pray and nothing happens. Why? Well, because of the way you're coming at the Lord, the way you're praying. Your whole attitude is wringing your hands in worry. It's not trusting the Lord and resting in Him. Now, there are a number of reasons in the Bible why you don't get an answer to prayer. In Psalm 66, it says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. Sin and keep you from getting an answer to prayer. In 1 Peter 3, Peter says, if a man mistreats his wife, he will not get answers to prayer. If he does not honor her and dwells with her according to knowledge, his prayers will be hindered. And in James chapter 4, he says, some people don't get an answer to prayer because they just are asking to consume it upon their lusts. Their desires are all wrong. Now, what's the problem? And I contend it goes back to verse 6, I should say, where the man is debating. He's struggling. He's divided within himself. All right, put your finger in James 1 and turn to Colossians chapter 3. And let me tell you what the Lord wants. Let me give it to you like this. Colossians chapter 3, and look at verse 22. Actually, we're talking about a slave at this point. It says, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. With sincerity or singleness of heart. The Lord wants our heart. And He wants us to have singleness of heart. I am choosing not to worry. And I am going to trust you that all things work together for good in this situation. This is for my good and your glory, and I'm going to gain out of this spiritual maturity. So I'm going to trust you. That's what the Lord wants. He wants that trust and that singleness of heart in your relationship with Him. Some time ago, I read a story about a missionary who had an orphanage. And in one of her little trips to a side village, she found a little orphan girl who had no parents and asked if she could come live in the orphanage. And the missionary said, I'm sorry, but I don't have any more room. don't have any money to build any more rooms, so until I get some and can build some more rooms for beds, I can't take you. And the little girl teared up and she said, I'm going to pray that you get more money. And the missionary said, when I do, I'll send you. And so she went back to her base, and when she got back, she discovered some people in America had sent her a rather large contribution, and now she was able to build. With that in mind, she sent one of the servants to go get the little girl. Now that was a round trip. It was going to take a whole day, half a day there and half a day back. So she sent him off in the morning, and by noon they were back. And she said, how did you make that trip so fast? She said, the servant said, I met her on the path. And the missionary said, what's wrong? What happened? And the little girl said, well, I asked the Lord to send you money, and so I knew He would, and I just thought I'd get a little head start on the trip. That's what the Lord wants, that little childlike faith that says, I'm going to trust you. I don't understand what's going on. Don't necessarily appreciate it, and it hurts, but I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you that you know what you are doing. So here's the point. If you don't do that, you're going to be unsettled in your soul and unanswered in your prayers. There's a third result. Look at verse 8. He is a double-minded man, and he's unstable in all of his ways. Now, in a sense, this is what we've been talking about. All the way back from verse 6, he's doubting, he's divided. This is where it really comes to the fore, that he's double-minded, like Mr. Facing Both Ways. But the point is this, and this is what I really think verse 8 adds. He's unstable. You're unstable. You're not just unsettled, you're unstable. That term was used of political unrest. It was used of a riot. So if you want to get the idea of what's going on in this person's life, think of rioting in the streets, that kind of instability, unsettledness, and you've got a picture of what he's talking about. Matter of fact, this word, if you want it, is think of it as a drunk man staggering down the street, unstable. But that's not the point of verse 8. It's true. The point is, in all his ways. In all his ways. Wow. We started out with just being unsettled in our heart. And now, if you don't get something settled, it could affect other areas of your life. For example, if you have a serious enough problem at home, can it affect you at work? If you have a serious problem at work, can it affect you at home? If you have a serious problem at home, can it affect you at church? Can it affect your relationships with your friends? Absolutely. Could it affect you physically? And you don't need a preacher to tell you that. Go talk to the doctor. They will tell you, a good cardiologist will tell you that one of the major problems is, in many cases, is stress. Right? It could affect you physically. Matter of fact, let me show you. That's in James. Turn to chapter 5. Now, in order to appreciate what I'm about to show you, you've got to remember chapter 1. Chapter 1 introduces the subject of trials. I think he's talking about trials all through the book, as I will explain before this week is over. He gets to chapter 5, and he goes right back to trials. Look at verse 13. Is anyone among you suffering? You having a trial? Then what do? Let him pray. Where have we seen that before? Chapter 1. What do you pray for? Wisdom. So if you're suffering, pray. All right? If you're praying for wisdom, meaning you're responding properly and you're trusting the Lord, then what's going to happen? Well, you're going to be rejoicing, right? So he says, is anyone cheerful? He's echoing chapter 1. Are you cheerful? Then what do? Oh, sing a song. And then out of the blue, he says, is anyone among you sick? Where did that come from? Well, if these questions mean anything in the context of the book of James, it's rather obvious that the first one says, are you having a trial? The second one says, are you responding properly? And the third one implies that you're not responding properly, you're responding improperly, and you are physically sick. Now, while I'm at it, and since this is such a controversial passage, would you like for me to explain when it's appropriate to be anointed with oil? And most people take this passage and say, if you're sick, go see the preacher and have him anoint you with oil and pray and the Lord will heal you. That's not what this passage is saying. Not even close. This is not talking about any sickness. It's talking about a sickness due to sin. And look carefully at what he says. I take that from the context of the book and from some other things that are said. But look at the passage in verse 14. Is anyone sick? Let him call for the elders of the church. By the way, I got saved in a Baptist church, and I got ordained in a Baptist church, and I pastor the Baptist church. I pastor a Baptist church now in Baptist teach that there are deacons and a pastor. The pastor's the elder. And I used to believe that until somebody pointed out the same construction in the book of Acts to me, where they ordained elders, plural, in each church, singular. Each church should have a plurality of elders. See the text? And matter of fact, I was in my car going from Minneapolis to Des Moines, about 70 miles an hour, which was the speed limit. And I was listening to a tape, and the man on the tape pointed that out, and I made a U-turn right in the middle of the freeway, mentally. And from that day to this, I have felt that a church needs elders. We have elders because of that verse in Acts, same construction. All right, call the elders. And what should they do? Well, they should pray and anoint him with oil. Now, there are two possibilities. The oil is medicinal, and if that's the case, you've got the pastor practicing medicine, and I don't like that at all. That doesn't set well with me. I'm not sure I want to go see an elder when I have a problem physically. Or it's symbolic, and I think that's probably the case. All right, what's going to happen if the elders, plural, pray? The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if, which could be translated since, he has committed sins, it'll be forgiven. Please note very carefully what happens. Does he get healed at this point? No. He apparently is sick, flat on his back in bed, and he gets enough strength to get up so he can go deal with this sin. Now look at the next verse. He says, confess your faults one to another. The Roman Catholic Church uses this verse to say that you should go confess to the priest. Matter of fact, I had a lady come see me last week. It was a Catholic, and she said, you're opposed to confessing to the priest. Right. What about this verse? And she brought up this very verse. Now let me show you what that verse says. Confess your faults one to another. I'm going to get technical for just a second. In the Greek text, that's a reciprocal pronoun, and a reciprocal pronoun means this. I'm going to confess to you, and you are going to confess to me. If this verse is teaching that you confess to a priest, the priest has to confess to you. So this is not talking about confessing to a priest. Well, what's it talking about? Well, I don't know for certain, but in chapter 4 it said, where do wars come from? There are conflicts going on in this congregation, and I take it that these two have gotten in a conflict with each other, and they haven't resolved it, and one of them was so bad it put him flat on his back. It's like going to the doctor and say, I got a pain in my neck, and the doctor says, who is it? So he says, Pray for one another. You're going to confess to one another, and you're going to pray for one another that now you may be healed. The prayer of the elders didn't get him healed. The prayer of the elders got him strength enough so he could go see the offending brother, and now they're going to get reconciled and pray for each other, and now he's going to get healed. I got off on the subject, but the point is this passage is saying that I think the anointing of oil applies only to people who are sick because of sin. The text says that, and the context, I think, indicates that. But my point is this: in the context of the book of James, if you don't respond properly to trials, you could get physically ill. Many years ago, I think I was in Oklahoma, and I was studying in the morning, as is my habit, and the pastor came to see me. I was in one room of the church, and he was in the office of the church. And he said, "Mike, there's a farmer, and would you come talk to him?" He said, "I've talked to this man over and over again. I've told him everything I know to tell him. I don't know what else to tell him. Would you come talk to him?" I said, "Sure." So I went to talk to this farmer. This farmer had problems in every area of his life. Financial, physical, with his wife, with his children, at church. There wasn't an area of this man's life that he didn't have a problem in. And so, having studied James at the time, I said to him, "When did it all start?" And he knew exactly when it started. As I recall, 2 years. And he knew exactly what had happened when it started. And I explained to him that it was possible that he should have responded to that trial properly, and he didn't. And because he's been grappling with the Lord in that problem, it's affected all the areas of his life. And when I explained all that to him, he said, "Did you read my diary?" Now hear me. You hear me well. If we don't trust the Lord, there are dire consequences. Unsettledness in our soul, unanswered prayer, and possibly being unstable in every area of our life. I didn't say that. Look at the text. You see it in the text? You know anybody like that? If you don't know many people. They're all over the place. So, the point I want to make today, in the midst of a trial, it is imperative that you trust the Lord and follow the instructions of the opening verses of James chapter 1. And if you don't, you will be unsettled, unanswered, and unstable in all your ways. Now let's put this in context of life. All right, so I have a trial. Some are minor. I'm talking about perhaps more serious stuff. And you don't respond properly to it. So what happens? Well, based on what you said this morning, I just will not develop in maturity that round. I'll wait till the next time it comes around. Maybe I'll get it later, right? No, it's a whole lot worse than that. It's not that you end up immature. It's that you end up unstable in all of your ways. It's a whole lot more than just missing one lesson in life. It could affect the rest of your life. So this is really important that you learn to trust the Lord in every situation. Call upon Him. Committed to Him, asking for grace to get you through it, to teach you. I'll tell you in the rest of the week how to get that wisdom. To teach me what I'm to learn from this so that I don't become unstable. Or as I said in the morning, don't just grow old, grow up. Now, I want to look at these three things and make a suggestion. The unsettled is personal. It's me. It's my soul. It's my heart. The unanswered is spiritual. It affects my relationship with the Lord. And unstable in all of my ways affects my relationship with other people. If it affects every area of your life, that includes your relationship with other people. So it is possible that not responding to a trial could affect you personally, could affect you spiritually, and could affect you socially. It could affect your relationship with the Lord, it could affect your relationship with other people, and it'll affect you. You will be unsettled and unstable in all of your ways. Say, Mike, aren't you being a little dramatic? I mean, you're making this sound like, just one trial. Come on. Can't you miss one or two? Well, possibly. Yeah, I guess that's possible. I mean, you're making it sound like, you started out talking about a teacher, and you're making it sound like if you failed one test, you flunked the course. I mean, isn't it possible you could just fail one test or two? And the answer is yes, it is. You get a poor grade, maybe still graduate. But let me tell you what else is possible. That you fail that one test, you fail the class, and that means you don't graduate. And that could affect you the rest of your life. Matter of fact, I saw that happen. Let me tell you a story. I had the privilege of going to Dallas Seminary. Back in the days when I went to Dallas Seminary, there were only 2 degrees. You could get a master's degree in theology and get a doctor's degree. That was it. The master's degree was a 4-year course. And in that 4 years, you had to have 4 years of Greek and 3 years of Hebrew. It's a very, very demanding, rigid course. Scary. Now, most of us didn't take Hebrew until our 2nd year. Just tried to get our feet wet in the curriculum and then take Hebrew the 2nd year because we heard horror stories about how hard it was. Now, the way the curriculum was structured at the time, you had to pass Hebrew. And if you waited till the 2nd year to take it and you failed it, you could not continue. There was no summer school. Now, they have since changed all of that. When I was a student, that's the way it was. So I came upon a Hebrew exam. One of the toughest things I've ever wrestled with. I think I came real close to having a nervous breakdown because I wanted real bad to finish. And I remember till this day leaving the apartment and walking to my execution. Got out of the apartment, was walking down the street. And I passed a house, and next to the house was a separate garage with a tin roof. Just as I got to the driveway, a squirrel walked out on a limb. The limb broke. The squirrel crashed on that tin roof, rolled over and over and over down the side of the roof, landed on its feet, and scampered away. And when I heard the bang, I looked, and I saw it all. And I kept walking to my execution. That Hebrew exam. But when that happened, it was as if the Lord said, "Did you see that?" "Yeah, I did." Said, "I did too." Remember the bird? I see the bird. And something welled up in my soul. I said, "You know what, Lord? I'm going to trust you for this. I'm going to quit learning. Because I'm going to preach when I pass this exam. Will I get a degree from this seminary? I'm going to preach. So, Lord, I'm going to trust you." Now, let me tell you what happened. I got a D on that exam. The most gorgeous D you've ever seen. But I passed it. I had a friend named Bill, and he didn't pass the exam. The exam was on Monday. Bill said, I didn't flunk the exam on Monday, I flunked it on Friday. So I was in the library studying, and I had to mail a letter. And I left the library, and I walked out to Swiss Avenue, where there was a mailbox. I pulled the lid down on the mailbox, and I put the letter in it, and I thought, I can't do this. I'm going to fail this exam. Dropped the letter in the box, and virtually gave up. And he didn't pass the exam. And as a result, he didn't pass the course. And as a result, he did not graduate from Delaware Seminary. You mean you could fail one test and it had those kinds of dire consequences? Well, that may be an extreme illustration academically, especially today. But yes. So I want to drive home to you with all that is within me. No matter what happens, you must trust the Lord to have peace in your soul and not be tossed around like a cork in a stormy sea. Father, grant us the grace to trust you like that, so that we can have peace in our soul and harmonious relationships, and a relationship with you that gets answers to prayer instead of being tossed, unstable, unanswered.